The next speaker is John Lott. He is the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. And John is going to talk on facts versus false claims.
I guess I'm not going to talk quite yet.
No, he's not going to talk quite yet. John very kindly flew in from El Paso and fit us into his schedule, and we really, really appreciate it. But he missed the luncheon. But it is my honor to present John with the Scholar of the Year Award. John has won this several times, but
more than that. But you ought to give it to somebody else once in a while.
Well, you know what? You have to train somebody else to come and take your place,
right. Well,
or no, to assist you. So.
Well, I'm not going to be around forever. So,
all right.
Anyway, thanks very much. That's nice of you. You know, it's I wasn't going to talk about this, but it's only half joking because yeah, I'm 57. Okay, it may not seem like that sometimes. To me, it does. And there's only so many years I'm going to be able to go and do stuff. And so one of the reasons I'm hoping we can use the Crime Prevention Research Center is to train other people to go and do empirical work. It's hard for people even with moderately conservative views to get through graduate programs. And there's so much of a gap between kind of what is the formal econometrics training that people get and actually being able to use those numbers. And I worry that if we don't replicate the types of skills that we have, then we're going to lose the battle. I mean, there's lots of money on the other side. You know, Bloomberg, you may hear about the $50 million that he spends each year, but he's literally spending a lot more than that on funding public health programs like they have at Johns Hopkins. I mean, I don't think the work that they do is very good, and I'm going to talk about that more in my talk here. But somehow we have to go and train people to be able to go and do statistical work. And I'll get to this more later, but I appreciate the award. I don't know, this is the 5th or 6th time or whatever it is, I've lost count. But I'm just saying, if only to encourage other people, we should do that. So I did what, before I got to my main talk, I was listening to the talk before me about the Urban Initiative. And I know you guys have heard me, anybody's read my books know my feelings on this, about who benefits the most from owning guns. And it's basically two groups of people. One obvious group that's relevant to the Urban Initiative that was just talked about is it's basically the people most likely to be victims of violent crime. And that overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks and who live in high crime urban areas. About 75% of the murders in the United States take place in about 3% of the counties. And, you know, what we have to do is, the most vulnerable people in our society, I think, benefit the most from having guns, whether it be people who are most likely to be victims or people who are relatively weak, particularly women and the elderly. You know, if you look at Pew polls, one of the groups that they've shown that's shown the biggest changes in their views on guns, there have been two groups, basically women and blacks. Now you have a majority of blacks for the first time since that they've been doing these types of polls who will say that owning a gun is important to make them safer. But what I think is that so much of the gun control regulations that are being pushed consciously are set up in order to try to disarm those very people who benefit the most. So you look at Maryland. They just now, after 2013, it costs about $300 to go through the process to license and register handguns. For a lot of the people in this room here, that's not going to make the difference between whether or not you're going to be able to go and buy a gun or not. But for poor blacks, let's say, who live in Baltimore, that $300 may make the difference between whether they go and buy a gun. And so here you have the irony that not only are they imposing this large effective tax on people being able to go and get a gun, but we have this image earlier this year in Baltimore where police are told to stand down and not stop the riots in those particular areas that are there. You know, you look at Colorado and Maryland also provide an interesting illustration, and that is in 2013, when Colorado passed its expanded background check, one part of the law imposed a state tax on the transfer of firearms. Lori Sain and a couple other legislators who I was working with at the time put up an amendment on the bill that would have exempted people below the poverty level from having to go and pay that tax. With the exception of 2 pro-gun Democrats in the state house, every single one of the Democrats there voted against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay that tax. How many taxes can you name that Democrats would vote unanimously or virtually unanimously against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay? In Maryland, they had a similar issue when they were there was a brief attempt to try to exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay these over $300 in fees. The problem is that since the Democrats controlled over 2/3 of both the state house and the state senate, they wouldn't even let that amendment come up for a vote. And you look across the country in terms of concealed carry permits, a place like Illinois, it costs over $500 to go through the process to go and get a concealed carry permit. Who are you stopping? There are 2 impacts that that high fee has. One is it reduces the number of people who go get permits. But the second thing is it changes the mix of people who go and get concealed handgun permits. You're much less likely to go and get poor minorities who are likely to be victims of violent crime to go and get that. And so both of those things reduce the benefit, because if you don't have the people who are likely to be victims being able to kind of raise the risk of criminals going and attacking them, you're not going to have the same deterrent effect as you would if you could prevent where the vast majority of crimes are. So I could go on, but it's just in listening to the talk before me, the gentleman there, it just kind of raised some thoughts in my mind that I wanted to point out, because I think one thing that's important is to emphasize what I honestly believe is the racist nature of a lot of the push for gun control, how it marginalizes and victimizes some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And so I was going to talk for a minute about part of what I think is kind of going through Michael Bloomberg's mind, or the people who work at Everytown. If you look at polls over the last few decades, what you see is that basically support for gun control, depending upon which poll, either peaked around the late 1990s. And since then, support for gun control has been falling. You look over the last year or two, there's actually been a few polls that show that more people oppose more gun control than support them. The question is why it's been changing. And I think I've been looking at a lot of underlying polls, and I think the main thing that explains the changes over time has been the other polls where people have been asked, do you think a gun makes you safer or not, whether it be in the home or ownership generally? And those polls also began to change around the late 1990s, 2000. Gallup, for example, had a poll in 2000 that asked people whether they thought that gun ownership in the home made people safer or made it riskier. Maybe hard to believe, but in 2000, only 35% of Americans thought that owning a gun in the home made them safer. Okay? Last December, it was up to 63%. That's a massive change, but you can see from year to year, as the percentage of people, if it goes up, that you also see at that time an increase in the percentage of people who oppose more gun control. My guess is Bloomberg's seen those polls, and he understands that what's driving the increased opposition to gun control has been that people think guns on net make them safer, and they don't want to have government regulations that end up disarming them. Here's the problem, though. Since Bloomberg's seen it, he's basically tried a multifaceted approach. He's not just going and trying to go and push political stuff, though I could go and tell you stories from testifying around the country, what he's been doing there. But he's been putting in literally hundreds of millions of dollars into going and funding research. So I've warned about this starting in 2013, but if you look just over the last few months, you've seen a big increase in media coverage of new studies that come out. Every month now we're seeing several news stories, or several new studies that come out. Next year it's going to be a tidal wave coming up to the 2016 election. And the problem is that when these studies come out, they essentially are given completely uncritical coverage. You know, it's almost like free advertising that they get, and so they know they get this big return from this. So what Bloomberg's done is he's trying to change people's perceptions about whether guns make them safer or riskier. And then he has programs like at Columbia University's Dart School of Journalism, where he trains then journalists how to go and cover the gun issue. And at the same time, then he has his political arm that goes and uses those studies that he's been helping fund. He and Soros and the Obama administration and 23 different large foundations that were involved in the healthcare debate. So we're really talking about huge amounts of money that are being spent on these types of things. And you know, and he's putting all these together, but I believe he knows the importance of fundamentally making people think that guns make their lives riskier. Now, it's incredibly poorly done research that's there. And I can go through and give you a few examples. If you just look at studies that have come out in the last 6 weeks or so, you may have heard one study is that the states with the highest gun ownership had the highest rates of police fatalities that are there. How many people have heard about that? You know, it's particularly pernicious type of study because what I think they want to do is, I could also show you polls. Probably the one group of people who support private gun ownership more than any other group, and a lot of this is street officers I know, are police. You know, you go and you ask police questions, you know, Police One, which is the largest private organization of police in the country. They have about 450,000 members. 370,000 of those are active full-time law enforcement. You know, compare it, there's about 650,000 law enforcement in the country, so you get an idea how much they represent of all the police that's there. And, you know, you go and look at survey questions. Do they support people owning guns? Like 95% do. You ask them, do you think that private gun ownership is extremely important in reducing crime? I think it's like 55% believe that. If you ask them, do they think it's very important? About 22% do that. So 77% of police officers think that private ownership of guns is either extremely or very important in reducing crime. You know, it's pretty hard to think of almost any other group in the population that feels that strongly about that. But, you know, these types of studies, they're trying to chip away at that, trying to create some uncertainty on the part of police. So you have this study in the American Journal of Public Health. And, you know, I could go on for an hour, but let me just give you kind of one basic kind of lesson in statistics here. And that is, you know, there's 3 different types of data. And I know I've talked about this in past years for people who've heard me talk about it, or if you've read More Guns, Less Crime or The Bias Against Guns. There's either purely cross-sectional data, time series, or what we call panel data that combines those two. Virtually all academics use the broader set because it's simply not possible to control for all the differences across places in purely cross-sectional. You know, a typical example for cross-sectional, it would be, you know, somebody would say, look, the UK has a relatively low homicide rate, has a low gun ownership rate compared to the United States, so it must be the low gun ownership rate that's causing the low homicide rate. I would respond by saying, look, if you look before they had the gun control laws, they had even lower crime rates, okay? And they went up afterwards. They were still lower than the United States, but the gap between the United States and the UK has gotten smaller since they banned handguns, for example. Now, when the study used panel data, which basically means they looked at police deaths by state over a number of years, but they didn't do it the way any regular academic would have done that type of data. What you try to do, one of the benefits of having that data across many different states over many different years, is allows you to control for factors that there's no way you can control for otherwise. So you'd want to say there's something different about different places, like the UK versus the United States, and so you want to try to pull out the average crime difference in the UK and in the United States, and to see how those crime rates change over time relative to each other in the way I was just explaining when they have some type of change in law. Well, they don't have that basic control in there. The other thing that you have is, let's say crime rates are falling nationally from 2006 to 2007. If I have a change in law, I want to see whether the state that changed its law, not whether it fell, but whether its crime rate fell faster than the states that didn't change their law. Because otherwise what could happen is I may simply be picking up crime rates in the country tend to go up and down together. I don't want to just be picking up the fact that crime rates are falling across the whole country over a period of time. I want to see whether the ones that we're focusing on fell relative to the other ones. People understand the point there? It's a very trivial point, okay? It should be obvious to anybody who does empirical work. But they also didn't control for that. And what you can see, I wrote a piece for Fox that basically said, look, you fix and there are lots of other problems one could talk about, but you fix those problems, which essentially you do the data the way anybody who does this type of stuff would do, and their results reverse. What you find is that the states that had the biggest increases in gun ownership had the biggest relative drops in police deaths, okay? Which is the opposite. You these guys know what's going on. They know how people deal with this type of data. And you wonder how long they played around with it until they could go and get the results that they had there. But what you have to try to do is, places like the Crime Prevention Research Center, we try to go and respond to that. There's another study that came out a little while ago claiming that there's no evidence that states with more households with guns led to timid criminals. They were essentially saying there's no deterrence. You make it riskier for criminals, and criminals don't respond. They don't become less likely to go and attack people. Again, the same points that I just pointed out apply equally well to that study. And again, if you did it the way most people would normally do these studies, again, it reverses their results that are there. Another public health study that came out a little while ago was claiming that Connecticut, when it adopted its gun licensing law back in 1995, between 95 and 2005, had a 40% drop in firearm homicides. That's true. Seems like a completely irrelevant fact to me when you want to try to control for other things. So you want to say, well, homicides fell nationwide. Part of the thing is to see whether it fell faster in Connecticut relative to other places. But even more bizarre is, here's your paper that just came out a month or so ago. I don't know if you know this, but crime data has been released since 2005, right? Whenever I see something like this, little alarm bells go out, because I say, why did they pick one state? They claim they have 10 states with these laws, right? Why did they look at data through 2005? When I do a study, if you've ever read any of my work, I use all the data for all the states that are available for all the years that it's available. I give people an example. Let's say you flipped a coin 20 times, came up with 10 heads and 10 tails. But I let you go and pick any 5 coin tosses. You could pick 5 heads. Will you go around then claiming that that proves that it's an unfair coin, that's biased? I suppose you could claim that, right? But the point is that when researchers pick and choose what data they're going to use, rather than using all the data that's available, they better have a damn good reason why they're doing that type of picking and choosing rather than using it all. And of course, they don't even talk about that in this piece. But I'll just give you one example. I could go on for an hour with this study. If they had simply gone to 2006, the drop in firearm homicides in Connecticut would have been smaller than the overall drop in firearm homicides in the United States as a whole. It would have been significantly smaller. If they had gone to 2007, 2008, and so on, it would have continued to be smaller. And so, you know, at some point, you kind of, when you're an academic, you develop a sixth sense. When people do things in strange ways, it kind of sets off alarm bells saying, why did they do that? If you're going to do something like 2005, then not only should you have a good explanation, but you'd like to have a paragraph or a footnote in the paper someplace and say, oh, by the way, if we'd gone and done additional years of data, it wouldn't have changed our results, okay? But of course, they don't have something like that in that discussion. Now, looking for Julianne here to see how much time I got. I thought I'd talk a tiny bit about the issue of mental illness and guns because obviously it seems to be a big thing right now. And it's kind of put out as a panacea there that if we just have more mental health professionals, if we just make sure that people who have mental illnesses don't get guns, then we can go and make things safe. I'll just give you one interesting statistic from some of the research that we've done at the Crime Prevention Research Center, and that is, if you look at mass public shootings, about 52% of those doing the killing were actually seeing mental health professionals, psychiatrists or psychologists before they engaged in their attacks. So, you know, and the interesting thing is that even though they were seeing them, there's not one single case where this mental health expert was able to identify the individual as a risk to others prior to the attack. And when you go through and look at it, what you find is that there's actually a massive literature in the academic psychiatric literature about their inability to go and identify what turns out to be extremely rare cases of people going and doing these types of things. So it's no reason to blame them when you're dealing with such very rare cases to go and try to identify. But it makes one at least hopefully question, you know, these obvious cures that are being put forward on these things. The other thing that you realize is what a tiny percentage of people with mental illness actually go and commit violent crimes. You look at something like schizophrenia. You're talking about literally thousands of a percentage point of people who have schizophrenia who commit violent crime, let alone people who go and engage in these types of mass public shootings. Would we really want to go and say anybody who has schizophrenia or even, quote, you know, maybe some level of seriousness with it, not be able to go and own a firearm? Maybe there's an argument for it. But when you're dealing with such a tiny percent that may misuse the gun, you have to realize that there may be others who might actually benefit to some extent from being able to go and use a gun defensively. And we just have to be a little bit careful in terms of who we prevent from owning guns. You know, the basic issue, I would argue, is that if you really believe somebody was a danger to others, maybe we ought to think about just locking up the individuals. Because here's the problem, and that is if you don't lock them up, but you really believe that they're a danger, if you really just say, I'm going to stop you from being able to legally buy a gun, you know, you look at these types of mass public shootings. A short time for planning these types of attacks is 6 months. Some of these guys are planning these attacks for over 2 years in advance. The notion that you're going to be able to stop somebody from being able to go and buy a gun illegally just isn't very obvious to me. I mean, any more than it is to go and say you're going to be able to stop somebody from going and buying illegal drugs. And so if you really think that they're a danger, you know, maybe the background check might make it a little bit more difficult. But given the amount of time that people are involved in training these things, it's not particularly obvious. And so now we've had kind of the new kind of hot button law on this is California's violence restraining orders that got passed last year. And, you know, the irony is again, all the cases that get used for pushing this have nothing to do with the case. They have nothing to do with the law. So you had the Santa Barbara killer last year who killed 6 people and wounded 14 others in his rampage in Santa Barbara. This guy was seeing 3 psychiatrists, one of them a nationally recognized expert on the types of disorders that he had. He had been visited by two deputy sheriffs before the attack who had questioned him. None of those individuals viewed this killer as a danger to other people. So even if the law had been in effect and the sheriff's deputies had had the power to essentially go to a judge and have his guns taken away from him, these individuals didn't view that as something that they should have done in that instance. And of course, the Parker killer, Allison Parker, the journalist, her father, Andy Parker, has been pushing this law as a solution to his daughter's deaths. But in the killer there's no psychiatrist, there's no judge, there's no police, no one who had indicated or raised a flag that this individual had mental illness and therefore even would have been relevant for this. How long do I have? 2 minutes. Okay, so anyway, so let me just try to summarize by saying this, that there's a lot of stuff that's going to be coming out soon, and you're already seeing it's coming out. And we have to fight it on different levels. We have to fight it in terms of the research that's done. We also have to fight it politically. But a lot of these rules, and I hope, and I'm glad that people spoke before me on the urban initiative, I really think we ought to push harder back on who's being stopped by these costs. So we talk about expanded background checks. In Washington, D.C., that adds $200 onto the cost of transferring a gun. In New York State, that adds $80. In Washington State, it adds $60, plus they just put another $25 tax or so on people obtaining a gun. That makes a difference. Those are real taxes. And who are the people who are most likely going to be disarmed as a result of those taxes? Anyway, what I'd like to end you with, I'd like to introduce you to Nikki Gozer. She's just joined the Crime Prevention Research Center over here. Nikki was the 2012 Sybil Ludington Award winner for the NRA, and she's made a huge difference. She's helped fight to get rid of gun-free zones in different places around the country. And we all owe her a debt for what she's gone through with that. So, you know, I kind of hope that together, you know, I kind of provide the intellectual stuff and she provides kind of, you know, makes it real to people about what's been going on. But one thing I'd like to encourage you to do, just so you can kind of keep up to the extent I can try to deal with the research that comes out, is go to our website at crimeresearch.org. And you'll see there's a little note at the top that will tell you how you can subscribe to our email newsletter that we put out. And for anybody, I know some people already subscribe to, you'll see when these studies come out, I try to put together an analysis that hopefully allows you to go and talk to others and use that information in order to try to push back on these things. So it's at crimeresearch.org. And I really appreciate your time, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here again this year.